So I was looking at 1 Samuel 15 and the Amalekites, and we were discussing some various options. What could have Israel done differently? Members of the Amalekites or the warriors who had been causing problems for Israel for close to between 200 and 400 years. We just concluded option one, and that is, they could have taken the orphans and widows as slaves, but we've demonstrated why that was impossible for Israel, and it would have been against Israel's own law to do that. If you haven't seen the previous video, I encourage you to look at it now and come back to this one. Alright, option two. Israel could have taken the orphans and widows and taken them back and turned them over to some social relief programs or processes in Israel or anywhere else for that matter. Now, the problem with this option is similar to the problem with option one, and that is there's just no social relief programs or processes adequate to take care of a bunch of dependent people. Remember, most of these people would have been nomadic dependents without actual agricultural or industrial skills, or minor children consumers without the ability to contribute to their upkeep. At a time before the agricultural surpluses of Israel could support such a large group of resident aliens. As marauders, the Amalekites did amass some gold, 1 Chronicles 18:11, and livestock, but God forbid the Israelite soldiers to take this with them as spoils of war, probably so Israel will not get a taste of raiding other nations for plunder and become like the Amalekites. So there were no social relief, welfare, and benevolent resources anywhere in the ancient Near East, even in the wealthiest of nations. Even elderly care was a major issue, but not addressed by the public sector. There simply was not enough resource, surplus, or infrastructure available to do this. Quoting from the care of elderly in the ancient Near East, ancient society has fewer elderly, it is true, but they existed nonetheless and had to be supported along with many children, most of whom would not survive to adulthood. Nonetheless, all the contributors stressed that the role of the public sector was limited. Let's be clear about this. We take these types of things for granted. They simply did not exist in the ancient world. This was not in any sense an option for this situation. Alright, moving to option three, leave them in the desert to face their fate. This, of course, is simply another form of death sentence, a slower death due to exposure, predatory animals, or possibly slave traders, or dehydration. To escape from a military victory was the same as escaping to a prolonged and agonizing death in the ancient Near East. Quoting from the daily life of ancient Mesopotamia, battle casualties were the major cause of death among adult males. Those captured on military campaigns most probably died of exhaustion and maltreatment. Those who managed to escape from their victors died of exposure, hunger, and you might remember that being left in the desert to die this way was a form of execution used in the Ottoman Empire, genocide mentioned earlier in this series. In other words, they were forced in the desert of present-day Syria, and most died slowly of starvation and dehydration. This situation is illustrated in the early story of Hagar and Ishmael. They were sent away into the desert by Sarah and Abraham, and death was expected. Look at Genesis chapter 21, verses 14 through 16. Form of death, generally taking a week or less, or is any less horrible than death from a sword with its terror, but over in minutes, will have to be left up to the reader. It is certainly not obvious to me that watching your loved ones die slowly and agonizingly is preferable to seeing them die almost instantly. And the possibility of staying alive but being captured by slave traders is not much more attractive, if any. Frequently in antiquity, people would commit suicide rather than become foreign bondage slaves, whose lot was quite different from homeborn servants. Whole groups of people would kill themselves when captured to avoid this horrible fate. Bradley mentions some of the most vivid instances. Most of the Spanish tribe of Cantabria, 22 BC, killed themselves when enslaved by Rome, cutting their own throats, drinking poison, or setting fire to their huts and dying in the flames. The inhabitants of Lycia undertook mass suicide 3 times after being captured by Cyrus the Great, Alexander the Great, and Brutus. 400 Roman soldiers killed themselves at the point of capture in 28 AD. The Athenians killed themselves in preference to being enslaved by Trajan. In these cases, people obviously prefer rapid death rather than even life in slavery, much less slow death in the desert. Why would we assume the Amalekite women and children would feel differently, especially in a culture that dealt in slave trading and apparently abused its slaves as well? Remember what I said this, I brought this up in an earlier video. Again, this is not obviously preferable to quick death, and indeed the data from suicide seems to indicate quite the opposite. Okay, so this brings us to option 4, kill them in the desert. We do have some data from antiquity that shows that people preferred quick deaths over slow, agonizing ones, and this data also comes from suicide events. Quoting from As the Romans Did, men condemned to participate in the amphitheater events in the Roman Empire realized that their deaths would be agonizing and painful. Some chose to commit suicide and spare themselves the torment. To this we might add the suicide of King Saul in 1 Samuel 31. We talked a little bit about that in this series, in which he desires to die rather than be tortured or abused, as described in Judges 19:25. We have already seen that people preferred quick deaths to normal foreign slavery, and in fact in antiquity people preferred quick deaths or suicides over many adverse situations in which they were still alive. Biblical examples included Samson, instead of ongoing bondage and abuse by the Philistines; Abimelech, instead of dying in disgrace; and Zimri, instead of facing political reprisal at the hands of his rival. Extra biblical data supports this as well. So if we accept the reality of lack of social infrastructure necessary to support such a group, this final alternative looks like the least painful and least dehumanizing, judging from the data concerning suicide in the ancient world. There is nothing laudatory about it, to be sure, but the moral difficulty was forced on the Israelites by the Amalekite warrior aggression. The fact that the destruction of the Amalekites warrior group was required to end the continual anti-Israelite savagery forced the Israelites into this situation. What this means is that the ancients disagree with moderns over what is morally acceptable euthanasia. The ancients, from the evidence of suicides, clearly believed that a sudden death was preferable to the anticipated life of future suffering, or an anticipated death by starvation, thirst, or exposure or torture, i.e. bond slavery or capture by foreign rivals or rulers. Accordingly, this means that our modern intuitions about the morality of various types and ranges of euthanasia may need further analysis, and that although most forms of ancient euthanasia, suicide would have been painful and violent, generally involving swords, not poison, they would have been considered morally wrong. And since there is no explicit censure given in the Bible for the suicides mentioned, it would be premature to decide what ancient criteria for acceptable euthanasia was less moral than modern criteria, given the case of anticipated sufferings, or sometimes allowed in the modern world, especially in wartime situations. POWs, for example, have been known to request death from other soldiers to avoid the future of anticipated torture and death. I remember vividly the first time I was confronted with this concept. I glanced at a TV screen at a scene on TV. I wasn't watching the show at all, but was struck by the image of two heads sticking out out of level ground. And as I watched this, as I turned into the situation, I saw something that deeply disturbed my thinking. The hero cowboy had ridden up to his friend on horseback to the spot at level ground, which showed sticking out the ground were the backs of two human heads, one an Indian squaw and the other a pale-faced male. They had been buried up to their necks in the dirt, rendering them immovable, next to a fire ant mound. The hero read the Indian sign nearby and explained to his fellow that these two had been caught in some sexual impropriety some days back and were sentenced to die slowly and painfully by fire ants. Their heads were still recognized, but not moving or speaking. Unfortunately, the camera did not show their faces. The hero took out his gun and shot the two people, ending the agony which I cannot think of without squirming. I remember thinking, what was that really murder? It was deliberate, it was unprovoked, it was violent, but was it merciful?